Good day, GRIN community. Hope you're all feeling well and energized by what you've heard this week. It's Vanessa and Shash, the GRIN Village Wokes. Vanessa is on about gender again, and I'm on about race. Could you turn to the person on your right and high-five them, just to remind us that... Just to remind us that tension and friction in connection sometimes has a positive outcome. Vanessa and I are also going to high-five each other every time we get uncomfortable, so it might get noisy up here.
So the inspiration from this talk is from folks like Victor in the back, who continue to ask the tough questions of us. They ask the questions about diversity, about community voices, and really pushing back on our natural science perspectives. What we want to say is that it doesn't always have to be Victor, and we want to share the labor of systemic change in our community. Sorry, still me. So there's this growing recognition that the legacies of colonial resource extraction and exclusionary conservation have done untold harm to ecosystems and our relationship with nature. But there's also this increasing acknowledgement that the way that our scientific and practice disciplines have been built on the oppression of people need to change, and that the discrimination and the biases that continue in our fields need to be dismantled. So as an interesting thought experiment, I chose a random sample of GRIN plenary sessions and the discussions from those sessions from the past few days. And I timed how long people spoke, how long you spoke for. So this was just a very simple, quick and dirty tool to help us all reflect a bit on our positionality and who is taking space. It's kind of interesting, right? So, as we said, there are a lot of narratives for the need for decolonization and more social diversity in sustainability science and in conservation. And they're both gaining traction, but also gaining some pushback. The literature really sees the importance of transformation as it needs to happen from the outside in and from the inside out. So O'Brien and Signa have framed this as the need for personal transformation as well, and I know that people like Jean have been working on this, particularly in higher education. And yeah, I think, sorry, I'm trying to find where we are. I think we as a community understand quite a lot about conservation. Sorry, God. Okay, high five. We understand quite a lot about how to do social-ecological transformation, but we're always asking that question of the outside. What about us? So as two researchers and friends, we found ourselves really discussing this together and examining how do we as researchers and practitioners go about changing the system when we benefit from the system as it is now.
I think this is still
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. So as Lotte talked about, reflexivity is really a critical self-reflection on our biases, our blind spots, and our defaults. And it critically has to happen within our research and practice processes. If left untouched, these dimensions can become the elephant in the room that prevents effective collaboration. So in this presentation today, we want to explore how and why our research practice can benefit from this personal reflexivity. And we present a dialogical, so about dialogue, exploration of our positionality. This is very much a work in progress, so we're not presenting findings today, but more our experiences along the journey. And we view GRIN as a safe space to explore these thoughts. So we want to share where we are, and we'd love to hear with you how this lands with you.
Okay, so Vanessa and I come to reflexivity from different starting points. My arts training involved hyper-reflexivity around who makes or does what kind of work, and I've grown in awareness about the role that my whiteness plays, and speaking isiLungu may play, in my disciplinary power structures and teaching. So isilungu is a name for English that is also associated with whiteness.
So I come to reflexivity from a different perspective. I trained in ecology and geography, where one's position in knowledge production was not part of my training at all. But I increasingly find myself in situations where I'm a northern-funded white researcher in, for example, the rural Eastern Cape, and I become increasingly uncomfortable and aware that I have a lot of responsibility that comes from my privilege, but also how this is in tension with me not wanting to speak for others.
Okay, so how do we practice reflexivity? We practice it on very long voice notes, which serve as a digital talking stick. It gives the opportunity to talk and develop our thoughts without interruption and with full attention. This borrows from Klein's time to think. So as busy mums, where do you find the time to think? In the car, on the voice note. It's like a trust fall, in that you trust that the listener will catch you. And Vanessa's signature phrase in loving academic solidarity is, I'd like to push back on that. So really helping each other by pushing back entails being kind rather than being nice. Kindness involves empathy, respect, compassion, care, ubuntu, as well as honesty, risking offense to ensure transformational change or help someone. Whereas niceness can be surface level, polite, coherent with social expectations. It has its place, but it doesn't necessarily push the envelope.
It's you.
Me. Okay. So our personal reflexive discussions pointed us to the role of race, whiteness, and white supremacy in our research experiences. Starting to feel a little uncomfortable. Our position is that race is a social construct. Racial categories are changeable and do not innately exist, and yet the world is organized as though race is a real, absolute thing. Administratively, meanings differ according to the region, so mixed and colored mean different things according to where you are in the world. The term whiteness or blackness, just a reminder, does not refer to skin color, but to a culture or a set of experiences or a mental attitude. So some may have seen the story of Mari van Heerden, who's a woman of color brought up by a white Afrikaans family on a farm, and she bravely did an interview explaining her cultural experience. In her own words, she's a white Afrikaans woman in a black body. Social media responses from South Africans to her story are very interesting, sometimes unkind, surprised, pity, rejection, but she's actually theoretically correct. So, in terms of the fact that she's brought up so-called white, showing the need for nuanced societal understandings about race and culture. And then just to push this a little bit further, Mbembe suggests that a non-racial context is actually truly about radical sharing and universal inclusion, including between humans and non-humans. So this discussion about race can go into species and everything, the rest of creation. So cultural whiteness grew along with white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and gives prominence to white perspectives and bodies in contemporary discourse, while making this dominance invisible by representing whiteness as the standard or norm. And this even happens in things like Harry Potter novels. It's very, very kind of implicit. We may think that this is old ground, but the KKK has been emboldened by the presidency of Donald Trump, the former presidency, with a concomitant pushback against diversity, equity, and inclusion, with prominent twits such as Elon Musk sharing anti-DEI sentiment, equating DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, with racism. What is important for our context is that while we may equate white supremacy with the KKK or angry, wealthy white men, it's latent in more subtle forms in Western culture. You don't even have to be a white supremacist to uphold white supremacy. And in a similar way, you don't have to be a man to uphold patriarchy. So because of the nature of reflexivity and our awareness of the privilege of living in skin categorized as white, we often seem to be in opposition to ourselves, playing devil's advocate to tease out our blind spots. We cannot help noticing the ways that white and Western ways of doing research are still foregrounded. We noticed ourselves speaking more in research contexts and that our perspectives were taken up more often than our BIPOC colleagues. We noticed our own responses when being questioned by others or ourselves about our relative positions of power in a research setting.
So, for example, I felt really paralyzed and uncomfortable when I was asked why I, as a European settler, am leading a project about Indigenous perspectives. And I want to amplify the voices of marginalized people, but am I taking up research funds? Am I taking up speaking time?
Okay, and I noticed the way that certain research funding criteria lock researchers into somewhat parasitic engagements in community contexts. Not always, but it can happen. So this is just a key quote that kind of guides thinking. The injustices and harms perpetuated by white supremacy, racism, cultural erasure, and rape culture are systemic problems distributed across institutional operations and everyday contact. So what is our response to this? Shame, fear, paralysis are not helpful. We get stuck between virtue signaling, white fragility, white guilt, wokeness, and the woke pushback, class and gender stereotypes, the realities of extreme inequalities.
Oh, that one needs a high five.
We're running out of time as well. So just a few sort of insights that we'd gathered. Our insights are mainly from feminist theories of color. So one particularly important one is both and thinking. This is the inward focus on, in a sense, a relational rather than binary approach, not pigeonholing ourselves or others in black and white or us and them thinking. We need to tick the white box for equity. We don't have to tick it in our minds, lives, and hearts. And so doing that places us apart from the rest of humanity, just as ticking the human box may place us apart from the rest of creation. So lastly, Bell Hooks explains that learning to look inward and outward with a critical eye helped her to decolonize her mind. This includes having the courage to face internalized white supremacist thinking in order to heal, and that this is easiest in community. So choosing love as a practice of freedom was critical affirmation from colleagues walking a similar path. And lastly, another guide, an outward-focused or a community-focused tactic that we just keep in mind is the framing of ally versus accomplice versus savior, which is a different way of looking at the so-called good intentions that accompany white interventions.
So what we want to leave you with today is this sense of ours that our dialogue, our long voice notes, helped us to steady one another in thinking about these very big, heavy things. We supported each other throughout and it helped to define our concerns and balance each other on this unsteady ground. It helped us also to reframe what we were feeling ashamed about as to what we could feel brave about. And particularly in changing our way of working in order to disrupt these dominant value systems. So we welcome feedback from everyone here in the GRIN community on whether and how we need to have more sustained conversations about this, and perhaps, as Dirk puts it, around the nighttime fire, and whether there's any appetite to reflexively surface these big elephants in the room, and towards personal healing and social-ecological transformation. Thank you.